Silas Rourke was near 70 years old, on his knees in the dark, and the men who had come to save his bridge stepped over his tools without a word. He was repointing a stone pier by lantern light. The mortar had gone soft in one joint, no wider than a thumb, and he was pressing new lime into it with a jointing iron worn smooth by his own hand. The engineers came down the embankment in their good boots. One of them kicked his chisel aside. Another set a boot heel on the edge of his mortar board and never looked down to see whose work he was standing in. Silas did not look up. He set the stone true and kept his hands moving. The chief engineer was a man named Preston Vale. He wore a tailored coat the color of wet slate, and he had a gallery of railroad men behind him, 40 of them, town officials and company clerks, and the superintendent himself. Vale lifted his voice so it would carry. "The company pays me $9,000 to build with mathematics," he said, "not to coddle a stone picker who can't read a load table." The 40 men laughed. It rolled down the riverbank and off the water and came back thinner. And the camera, if there had been one, would have stayed on the old man's hands. Because in the canvas roll beside his knee, wrapped in oilcloth, gone gray with age, Silas Rourke carried a single keystone. It was cut with a mark no man standing on that bank could read, and not one of them ever thought to ask. If you believe respect is earned in silence, this story is for you. Before we go on, if stories about the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the people the world laughs at right up until the moment it needs them, are the kind you'd sit and listen to twice, then take a second and subscribe. And comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, come back to the river with me. The Two-Rivers Trestle stood where the Halloran and the Muddy came together below the town of Halloran's Bend, out in the territory, and it had stood there in one form or another since 1849. Silas Rourke had tended its stone piers for 30 years, longer than the railroad had owned the line. He had come out to it as a younger man, when the Pacific and Meridian was still just talk and a survey stake, and the crossing was the old timber and stone kind that the freight wagons used before the rails ever came through the pass. He set no charges. He drew no plans. He kept stone true with a plumb bob, a chisel, and a pair of hands that had learned the trade from his father, and his father before that. Those men had set bridge stone against floodwater. In the old country first, where the rivers ran fast off the mountains and took a stone crossing every spring if it was built wrong. And then here, in this valley, before there were rails or towns or superintendents to laugh on a riverbank, they had built the crossings that stayed. That was the whole of it. Other men built crossings, and the water took them, and the Rourkes built crossings, and the water let them be. He was a quiet man. That was the first thing anyone in Halloran's Bend would tell you about him, if you could get them to say anything at all. Silas Rourke didn't talk unless there was something worth the breath. He came into town on a Saturday for flour and lamp oil and a word with his daughter, and he went back out to the river, and that was his week. He lived in a small stone house he had built himself, up the bank from the trestle, close enough to hear the water change its voice in the night. He knew that sound the way a mother knows a child's cough in the next room. He could lie in his bed and tell you whether the river was rising or falling with his eyes shut. He had learned it slow, over 30 years, and he never once thought of it as a thing worth mentioning to anybody. There's a story they told in town, though Silas never told it himself. Old Widow Pruitt's well had gone bad one summer, the stone coping cracked and slumping, the water fouled with grit. She had no money to speak of, and no man to fix it. Silas heard about it on a Saturday. He came by on a Sunday with his tools in a barrow and spent the whole day on his knees at her well, taking the coping apart stone by stone, cleaning each one, and setting it back so true you could have run water in a trough along the top and not spilled a drop. She tried to pay him with a jar of preserves. He took the preserves. He would not take the coin. That was the man. The town of Halloran's Bend respected him the way you respect a thing that has always been there and always done right, which is to say, mostly, they didn't think about him at all. He was like the trestle. He was part of how the world was put together, and you don't thank the ground for holding you up. His daughter was Mary Rourke, widowed young, running the boarding house on the main street with her sleeves pushed up and her hair coming loose by noon. She had her father's steadiness and her mother's tongue, which meant she could tell you a hard truth and make you glad she'd done it. Silas ate his Sunday dinner at her table most weeks, and it was the one place he softened. One of those Sundays, with the light coming gold through the boarding house window and the plates cleared, a drummer staying the week had asked Silas what line of work he was in, the way strangers do. Stone, Silas said. And that was going to be the whole of the answer. But Mary, wiping the table, said it for him. Said it easy, the way you'd mention the weather. The family used to build the crossings the army couldn't. Back before all this. My grandfather. His grandfather. She flicked the crumbs into her palm. There's a story the water couldn't take a Rourke bridge. My father won't tell it. So I do. Silas said nothing. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on its saucer and let it go by. The drummer laughed, thinking it a joke, and asked for the butter, and the moment closed over like water over a dropped stone. But it had been said, and you'll want to remember it was said. Because that spring, the company came. The Pacific and Meridian had a problem, and the problem was cattle. The big spring drive was coming down out of the North Range, thousands of head bound for the railhead, and the ranchers had contracted their freight on the P&M line, cattle to the cars over the Two-Rivers Trestle, and east to the markets. If the trestle carried the freight, the company made its season. If it didn't, the ranchers would drive their herd the long way to a rival road, and the P&M would default on a note the bank held against the whole spur. The trestle was old. That was the trouble, as the company saw it. 30 years of freight had run over it, heavier every year, and the deck timbers wanted replacing and the whole thing wanted, in the language of the head office, modernizing. So they voted $40,000 of new ironwork, and they hired a chief engineer at $9,000 to see it done before the drive came down. The chief engineer was Preston Vale, 34 years old, and he came off the morning train in that slate coat, with a leather case of drawings under his arm and the look of a man who has never once in his life been wrong in a way that cost him anything. He was not a fool. That's worth saying plain, because it would be an easier story if he were. Vale had gone to a good school back east. He could read a load table the way a preacher reads scripture, and he knew the tensile strength of wrought iron to the decimal, and he had built 2 bridges already that stood and carried and did exactly what his numbers said they would. He believed in the numbers. He believed a bridge was a sum, and if you did the sum right, the bridge stood. And if it fell, you had done the sum wrong. And there was nothing else to it in heaven or earth. He came down to the trestle his first morning with his junior man and a crew of laborers, and he looked at the stone piers the way you'd look at something left behind by a people who had died out. Quaint, he said. His junior man was Tom Ainsley. 22, honest to a fault, still young enough to believe that being right and being listened to were the same thing. Tom had a good eye and a habit of keeping his mouth shut and watching, which is the most useful habit a young man can have and the hardest to keep once older men start telling him he's clever. Vale spread his drawings on a plank laid across 2 barrels and read the load tables aloud to the crew, the numbers rolling off him, and every so often he'd gesture at the old stone piers standing in the brown spring water and shake his head at how anyone had ever dared to run a train over such a thing. Silas was there. He was always there. He was down on the center pier that morning, the big one in the middle of the channel, running his hand along a joint where the water had been working. He had felt something in the night. A change in the river's voice, a note under the note, and he had come out at first light to put his hand on the stone and ask it what was wrong. Vale saw him and called across the water. "You, old man. Off there. This is company work now." Silas looked up. It was the first time he'd looked up at any of them. He had a face like a stone that's been in weather a long time, all the softness worn off it, nothing left but what lasts. "The center pier's the one to watch," Silas said. Not loud, just said it. Rivers found the footing on the upstream side. "You'll want to look at that before you look at anything else." Vale smiled the way a man smiles at a child who has told him how to do his own trade. "We'll be taking soundings and running the calculations, thank you. We build with mathematics here, not with feelings about the water." He turned back to his crew. "Get him off the pier before he falls in, and the company owes his widow." "He's got no widow," Tom said, quiet, before he could stop himself. "He's got a daughter, runs the boarding house." Vale didn't hear it, or didn't care to. But Tom had said it, and Silas heard, and something passed between the young man and the old one across the water that neither of them named. Silas gathered his tools. He came off the pier without hurrying and without a word more, and as he passed near where Tom stood, the young engineer saw the canvas roll under his arm, and saw the corner of the oilcloth, and saw, for just a moment, the edge of a cut stone inside it. A pale stone, dressed smooth, with something incised into its face. A mark. Tom couldn't read it, but he'd seen enough stone cutting on the job to know a mason's mark when he saw one, and to know that a man doesn't carry a keystone wrapped in oilcloth for 30 years unless it means something. He filed it away. That was the thing about Tom Ainsley. He filed things away. That afternoon, working alone on the oldest pier, the one nearest the north bank, the first one the crossing had ever had, Tom found something that made him stop cold. He was clearing weed and silt off the base of it to take a measurement, and there, cut into the foundation stone below the old waterline, worn but plain, was a mark. He'd seen that mark before. That same morning, on the edge of a stone wrapped in oilcloth under an old man's arm. The oldest pier, the one that had stood in the channel since 1849 and had never, in 40 years of flood, moved so much as the width of a knife blade. It bore the same mark as the keystone Silas Rourke carried. Tom didn't say anything to Vale. He wasn't sure yet what there was to say. But he wrote it in his field book, in the small, careful hand he used for things that mattered, and he underlined it once. The days went on, and the work went up. Vale's iron came in on the flat cars, great riveted girders and bracing and bolt plates, and the crew set to hanging it off the old stone like armor on an old horse. It was good iron, well made. Vale's plan was to carry the whole load of the deck on the new ironwork and let the stone piers stand as they were, doing less and less, until they were just something for the iron to rest a foot on. He was proud of it. You could see he was proud. He'd stand on the bank at the end of a day and look at his ironwork catching the last light, all straight lines and bright bolt heads, and you could see him seeing his name on it. The Meridian Cut contract was the next one down the line. The big one, and a man who modernized the Two-Rivers Trestle on time and under the eye of the superintendent was a man who'd get the Meridian Cut. And then came the inspection. The superintendent was Josiah Kell, a heavy, careful man who had come up through the freight offices and knew to the dollar what the cattle season was worth and to the day how little time there was to make it. He came out on a special car with a party of company men and town officials, 40 of them or near it, to see what his $9,000 chief had done with his $40,000 of iron. Vale put on a show. He'd been planning it. He had the crew rig a load test on the new ironwork. A string of loaded gravel cars run out onto the deck and stopped over the span, and he stood on the bank with his drawings and read out the numbers, the calculated load and the tested load, and they matched, and he spread his hands as if to say, "There. You see, it is only arithmetic after all." The gallery made an approving sound. Kell nodded, slow, the way a man nods when he badly wants a thing to be true. And Silas Rourke, standing at the back where no one had thought to send him away yet, said, "The iron's not the trouble." It carried. In a lull it carried, the old man's flat voice, and 40 heads turned. Vale's face did a thing then. Just for a second, because he'd forgotten the old man was there. And now, here he was, in front of the superintendent, in front of the whole company, contradicting the arithmetic. "The water don't push where your numbers say," Silas said. He was looking at the center pier, out in the channel, not at any of the men. "You've hung all your weight to come down on that middle footing, and the river's already under it. When the rise comes, and it's coming, it'll not push against your iron, it'll pull the ground out from beneath your stone. You can't bolt iron to a thing the river's carrying away." For a moment nobody laughed. For a moment it hung there, the old man's warning, and something in the plain sureness of it made even the company men go still. And then Preston Vale laughed. He made himself laugh, big and easy, and he clapped a hand on the plank table where his drawings lay. "Gentlemen," he said, "I give you the last of the old school. A man who reads rivers by the feeling in his knees." He let them laugh with him now, and they did, glad to be let off the hook of taking a thing seriously. "Mr. Rourke, is it? Mr. Rourke has tended these piers, and we're grateful, but the day is past when a bridge is a matter of intuition and folk wisdom. I have surveyed that footing. I have the soundings. The riverbed under the center pier is sound rock." He turned to Cal. "Superintendent, I'll stake my contract on it." "Take him off the works," Cal said, not unkindly, just a tired man clearing a distraction out of his line of sight. "Let the engineer do his job." Two laborers walked Silas back up the bank. They weren't rough about it. One of them, an older hand named Meager, muttered "sorry, Silas" under his breath, and meant it. But the whole gallery watched the old man be walked away from the piers he'd kept for 30 years, and the whole gallery understood the meaning of it, and there was a low, warm ripple of laughter following him up the slope like water off a wheel. Silas did not look back. He walked up to the top of the bank and stood there a while with his tools in his hand, looking at the center pier and the brown water sliding around it, and then he turned and walked home to his stone house to listen to the river in the dark. Tom Ainsley watched him go. Tom had said nothing. He would think about that later, that he'd said nothing, and it would sit in him like a swallowed stone. The rise came 9 days after. It came the way spring rises always came to that valley, off the high snow melting fast in a warm wind, both rivers coming up brown and loud and full of trees. Silas heard it change in the night, 2 nights before it showed, and he lay awake listening, and knew. The iron held the deck. Give Vale that. His arithmetic on the ironwork was sound, and when the load ran over it, the girders never groaned. But the water came up around the center pier, and it did exactly what the old man had said it would do. It didn't push. It pulled. It found the disturbed ground on the upstream face of the footing, the ground Vale's crew had churned up setting their bolt plates, and it began, patient and enormous, to carry that ground away downstream a grain at a time. Scour, every bridge man learns the word eventually, and most of them learn it too late. The river undermining the footing from below, hollowing out the bed the stone sat on, until the stone had nothing under it but water. The center pier began to shift. It was small at first, a 1/4 inch. You'd not see it with your eye, but Tom Ainsley saw it in his instruments, saw the level go off true over 3 days, and he brought the readings to Vale with his heart going hard. Vale looked at the figures. And here is the thing about a man who has staked his name in front of 40 witnesses. He cannot afford for the old fool to have been right. It costs him too much. So Vale did what such men do. He decided the instrument was off. He decided the readings were settling, natural settling, the structure finding its seat. He ordered more iron, more bracing on the center pier, more bolts, more good wrought iron bolted to a footing the river was quietly eating out from under. You don't stop scour with iron, Tom said. He'd been reading. He'd been reading everything he could find since the night the old man was walked up the bank. Sir, if it's scour, More weight on that pier is the worst thing we can. It is not scour, Vale said. Because the riverbed is rock. And I have the soundings to prove it, and I will thank you to bring me solutions, Mr. Ainsley. Not the poetry of a stone picker you've apparently taken a shine to. So Tom took his poetry and his readings, and, that evening, he did a thing he wasn't sure he had the right to do. He walked up the bank in the dusk to the old man's stone house, and he knocked on the door. Silas opened it. He didn't seem surprised. He looked at the young engineer standing there with his field book under his arm, and he stood back and let him in, and he put the coffee on. They sat, the lamp between them. Outside the river talking. It's moving, Tom said, the center pier. It's gone off level near half an inch, and Vale's putting more iron on it, and I think you were right, and I don't know enough to know why. Silas turned his cup a quarter turn on the table, the old habit. The piers were never meant to fight the river, he said at last. That's the whole of it, son, and it's the one thing they can't seem to learn. Your Mr. Vale looks at that pier, and he sees a thing standing against the water, something for the flood to push on. So he braces it to push back, iron against water. He shook his head. Slow, you don't stand against a river. You'll lose. Every time. In the end, you'll lose. Because there's more river than there is you. Then how does it stand? For 40 years, the old one. How? Because my grandfather didn't build it to stand against the water. He built it to spread the load into the riverbed so wide and so keyed that the water can't get a purchase to start the scour in the first place. Silas held his two hands out over the table, fingers spread, and brought them down slow. Under the old piers, out where you can't see it, there's an apron. Set stone. Keyed together. And keyed into the bed, laid out wide on the upstream side, so the footing doesn't sit on one small patch of ground the river can steal. It sits on the whole riverbed. The load runs out into the stone and down into the earth so gentle the river's got nothing to pry at. He brought his hands flat and still. That's the craft. Not the standing, the spreading. Tom sat very still. Because it was, he understood in that moment, the most sensible thing anyone had said to him about a bridge in his whole education, and he had never once heard it in a schoolroom. Vale's iron, Silas went on, hangs all the deck weight down onto that one center footing, sharp, in one place. And his crew tore up the bed, setting their plates, so the old apron under the center pier, if there ever was a full one there, and I've my doubts. That pier was rebuilt after the war, and rebuilt wrong. It's blinded now, buried under iron and churned up ground. So the river's got its purchase. And it's taking it. He looked at the young man. It'll go. Not today. But it'll go. And it'll go when there's the most weight and the most water on it, because that's the way of these things. They wait for the worst day. The freight, Tom said. The cattle drive. That's 12 days out. If the herd's on the road and the trestle, then you'd best hope your Mr. Vale learns to hear the river, Silas said, before the river teaches him. And he would say no more that night. Tom went back down the bank in the dark, with all of it turning over in him. He didn't sleep, and 2 days later, out on the North Bank works, clearing the old riverbank where the spring rise had cut into it, and laid open a shelf of ground no one had seen in years, he found the survey stone. It was set flat in the bank, half buried, the kind of stone a surveyor leaves to mark a line. He'd have walked past it, but for the flood scouring the earth off its face. He knelt and cleared the mud off it with his thumb, and there, cut deep and plain and old, was a letter and a date. R. 1849. Tom knelt in the mud a long time, with his hand on that stone. 1849. The trestle went in 49. Everyone knew that. It was on the company histories. The first crossing at Two Rivers. But the company hadn't built it. The Pacific and Meridian didn't exist in 49. Someone had built the first crossing here 11 years before there was a railroad to run over it. Someone had surveyed this line and set this stone and cut a single letter into it to say whose work it was. R. Rourke. The piers had been built by a Rourke. The oldest pier, the one that had never moved, bore the same mark as the keystone the old man carried under his arm. And now here, cut in 1849, before the company, before any of them, a stone that said the same thing, that the ground itself under this crossing was Rourke ground, that the stone was Rourke stone, and that every man laughing on the bank 9 days ago had been laughing at the one person alive who knew what was actually holding their railroad up. Tom Ainsley closed his field book. He did not run to Vale with it. He had learned that much. He put the survey stone's mark down in his careful hand, next to the mark from the oldest pier, next to the mark he'd glimpsed on the oilcloth-wrapped stone, and he saw that they were the same, all three, and he sat with the enormity of it as the river ran loud and brown past the works and the light went out of the sky. He didn't know it yet, but up the bank, in the small stone house, the old man had already made up his mind. Silas Rourke had listened to the river for 2 nights running, and he had heard in it the thing he'd been afraid of. The center pier was going, not soon, but surely. And no one with the power to stop it would listen to a word he said, and asking again would only earn him another walk up the bank in front of whoever happened to be watching. So he stopped asking. That night, after Tom's lamp had gone dark down at the works, Silas took a lantern and his tools and walked the other way, upriver, to the old quarry his father had opened in the hillside 40 years before. The good stone was still there. It always would be. He set the lantern on a ledge, and he took up his chisel, and in the yellow light, alone, with the river loud below him, the old man began to cut. He cut voussoirs, the wedge stones of an arch, each one shaped to its place. He cut the keyed blocks of an apron, wide flat stones with the joints that would lock them one into the next, and all of them into the bed. He worked the way his father had shown him, and his father before, measuring with a plumb and a straightage, and the flat of his own thumb, dressing each face true, and setting it aside, and reaching for the next. He told no one. He asked no one's leave. It was not a scheme, and it was not a speech. It was a man on his knees in a quarry in the dark, cutting stone, because the stone needed cutting, and there was no one else left in the world who knew how. He worked till the lantern guttered, and somewhere in the black hours before dawn, with the chips gathering white around his knees and his old hands aching the way they'd ached for 50 years, Silas Rourke reached into his coat and took out the oilcloth roll and unwrapped it, and set the keystone on the ledge in the lantern light, where he could see it while he worked. The mark on its face caught the flame. His grandfather's mark, his father's, his own. He didn't know if any man would ever ask him to set it. That was the one thing he'd never learned to do, to offer. He only knew that when the river came for the center pier, and it would, the stones would be ready. Cut true and waiting. And down the bank, the freight was 12 days out, and the herd was already coming down off the range, and the water was still rising. The stones piled up in the dark. Night after night, Silas carried the lantern up to the quarry and came down before the crew woke. He cut voussoir. He cut apron blocks, wide and flat, with the joints that lock. He stacked them on the ledge under a tarp of oiled canvas, and he told no one, and no one asked. Down at the works, Preston Vale was busy being right. He had a way of standing on the deck with his thumbs in his vest, looking at the river like it owed him money. Every morning Tom Ainsley climbed down to the center pier with the instrument and took the reading. Every morning the number was worse. 1/4 inch. Then more. Tom would carry the figure up the bank and lay it in front of Vale, and Vale would look at it and hand it back. Settlement, Vale said. New iron finds its seat. It'll stop. It did not stop. The center pier had shifted half an inch off level now. Tom had measured it 3 times to be sure. Half an inch does not sound like much. On a bridge, half an inch is the ground opening under your feet. Tom knew it. And the old man knew it. And the two of them, who had never once been asked, knew it together and said nothing, because there was no longer anybody left who would listen. The clock was running. The freight was 12 days out when Silas first went up to the quarry. Now it was 9. 9 days, and the cattle drive already coming down off the high range, 1,000 head on the road, headed for the only crossing in 40 miles. If the trestle closed, the ranchers missed the freight. If the ranchers missed the freight, the Pacific and Meridian defaulted on its own note. Josiah Kell knew that arithmetic in his sleep. It was the only arithmetic he cared about. Kell came out on the 4th day to hear how it stood. He was a heavy man in a good coat, and he did not like the river, and he did not hide it. He stood on the deck with Vale and looked down at the water, brown and loud and higher than it had been the week before, and he asked the only question a superintendent ever asks. Is it sound? Vale had his load tables under his arm. He opened them the way a preacher opens a Bible. He talked about tonnage and safety factors and the tensile rating of the new ironwork. $40,000 of it bolted to the old bones of the bridge. He talked for a while. Kell was not a man who understood a load table, and Vale knew it, and that was rather the point. Sound per the calculations, Vale finished. I'd run the Sunday flyer over it tonight. Kell nodded, because it was what he wanted to hear. Then he looked past Vale, up the bank, to where an old man was walking away from the works with a canvas roll under his arm. That the mason, Kell said. Not a question. That's the mason. Vale did not turn around. Harmless, he putters at the old quarry. I let him. Keeps him out from underfoot. Kell watched Silas go until the trees took him. He did not say anything, but something in the set of his shoulders had changed. The way a man changes when a thing he stepped over starts, very faintly, to itch. That night, Vale nearly ended it. He had walked up past the quarry track after supper, restless, the way he got when the numbers on the pier would not behave. He heard the ring of a chisel in the dark. He followed it, and there, on the ledge in the lantern light, he found the old man on his knees among a field of cut stone, dressing the face of a wedge block with the flat of his thumb. Vale stood at the edge of the light. For a moment he did not understand what he was looking at. Then he did, and it made him laugh, low and mean. What is this? He nudged an apron block with his boot. You building a bridge in the woods, old man? Silas did not look up. He set his straightage across the face and sighted along it and took one more pass with the chisel. Cutting stone, he said. For what? Nobody asked you for stone. Vale crouched, elbows on his knees, studying the old man the way you study a lunatic. You know I could have you off this hill. This is company ground. That's company timber holding your lantern. Then have me off it. The chisel did not stop. Vale looked at the stack of finished stones under the tarp, a dozen of them, 2 dozen, weeks of an old man's nights, and he could not for the life of him make it mean anything. It was not a threat. It did not fit any table he owned. He decided, the way arrogant men decide, that a thing he could not read was a thing that did not matter. Waste your nights, he said, standing, brushing the quarry dust off his good trousers. God knows you've got nothing better. And he went back down the hill, and the ring of the chisel followed him all the way to the bottom, and he told himself he did not hear it. He should have stopped it. He came within a boot's kick of stopping it. That was the closest the whole thing came to going the other way. Kell was the one who let it stand. In the morning, Vale mentioned it over coffee, half a joke, the old fools carving headstones up at the quarry. Kell did not laugh. Kell was 9 days from a defaulted note and 1,000 head of cattle with no way across. And a man in that position will grasp at anything, even a thing he does not respect. "Let him," Kell said. "Costs us nothing. If the water does what he says it'll do, I'd sooner have a crazy man's stones than none." He said it to be practical. He did not believe it. But he said it, and that was enough, and the stones went on being cut. It was Kell who found the name. He had not gone looking for a legend. He had gone looking for someone to blame. That is a different errand entirely. The freight was closing, the pier was moving, and a superintendent who cannot stop a disaster can at least make sure it lands on some other man's head. So Kell sent to the district office for the line's founding papers, the old contracts, the survey of record. Everything from when the crossing was first thrown across the two rivers. He wanted to know, on paper, who had built the thing, so that when it fell he could say it was built wrong from the start and none of it was his. The papers came out on the 6th day, in a japanned box that smelled of dust and old ink. Kell opened it on the table in Mary Rourke's boarding house, because it was the only room in Halloran's Bend big enough, and he did not know whose house it was, and Mary served him coffee, and said nothing, and read the box upside down the way a smart woman reads everything. The survey of record was there. 1849. Before the Pacific and Meridian existed. Before the rails. Before the company. Before Vale was born. And under the survey, folded in quarters and soft as cloth, was the original contract for the crossing. Kell ran his thumb down it, looking for the fault, looking for the name to hang it on. He found the name. The crossing at the Two Rivers, the contract said, in a clerk's careful hand, was let to Rourke and Son, masons, for the sum of, and there followed a figure in old dollars that did not matter anymore. What mattered was the two words, Rourke and Son. The piers that had never moved, the deep old stone below the waterline that $40,000 of new iron was bolted to and could not improve, that was Rourke work. Built before the company. Standing when the company arrived. Standing still, and the old fool up at the quarry, the stone picker Vale had walked off the works in front of 40 men, was the son of that son, and the son of the man before him. The last of them. Kell set the coffee down very carefully. He looked at the contract a long time. Then he looked up at the woman who had poured his coffee, and something in her face, the plain, steady patience of it, told him the rest before he asked. "Rourke," he said. "My father," Mary said. "The family used to build the crossings the army couldn't." She said it the way she'd always said it. Thrown away, never dwelt on. She took his empty cup. "He'll be up at the quarry, if you want him. He's always up at the quarry now." Josiah Kell had gone hunting a man to blame, and he had found, in his own company's founding ledger, that the only work on the whole cursed bridge that had never once failed was the work of the man he'd let his chief engineer humiliate. He went pale. Mary saw it. She'd seen it before, on other faces, though never on one that mattered this much. He did not go up to the quarry. Not yet. Pride is slow, even when it's cracking. He folded the contract back into its quarters and sat with it, and outside the window the river went on rising, and somewhere up the hill a chisel was ringing, and Josiah Kell listened to it now, the way you listen to a clock in a sick room. The flood crested early. It was not supposed to. Vale's tables had it 3 days off, but the river does not read tables, and a warm rain came down on the high snow 2 nights running, and on the 7th day, in the black hour before dawn, the Two Rivers came up all at once, brown and roaring and full of trees, and it went for the center pier the way it had been going for it all along, only now it had the strength to finish. Tom Ainsley was on the deck with a lantern when it started. He felt it before he heard it. A shudder came up through the timbers into the soles of his boots, low and wrong, a sound a bridge should never make. He swung the lantern down over the rail. The center pier was moving, not settling. Moving, the water had scoured the bed out from under the upstream footing. exactly the way the old man said it would, and the great stone base was leaning downstream into the current an inch at a time, and the new iron, the $40,000 of new iron, was doing precisely what it was built to do, which was hold the deck rigid, so that instead of flexing, it shrieked. And a shear bolt the size of Tom's wrist sheared clean through, with a crack like a rifle, and went into the river. "Get Vale," Tom shouted at the watchman. "Get Kell. Get everybody." Now, they came down in the rain in their nightclothes and their coats, 40 men who'd laughed once, and they stood on the bank in the lantern light and watched the center pier of the Two-Rivers Trestle lean out over the flood. The deck had begun to sag above it, a long, slow dip in the black iron line of the rails, and every man there who knew anything knew what a sag in the rails meant. The Sunday freight was due at dawn. The first cattle were 9 miles up the road, and the bridge was going into the river. Vale worked his numbers by lantern light on the bank. His hands were not steady. He called for jacks, for more bolts, for a bracing timber under the footing, orders that made sense on paper, and none at all against a river in flood. His men splashed out to obey and came scrambling back when the current took a whole cottonwood past their knees. He called the orders again. Louder. Nobody could reach the pier. The water would not let them. His last calculation, shouted over the roar of the flood to a crew that could not carry it out, died in the rain in front of every man who'd ever believed in him. Kell stood 10 feet away and watched it die. And then Kell turned around and looked up the bank, to the dark of the quarry track, and made the walk that pride had kept him from all week. He went up alone, bareheaded, the rain running off him. He found the old man not cutting now but loading, apron blocks onto a stone boat, the wide sledge his father had used, an ox already in the traces, as though Silas Rourke had known to the hour when the river would come and had simply been waiting for it to arrive. The finished stones were stacked and ready, cut true. Waiting, just as he'd said. Kell stood in the lantern light with his hat in his 2 hands like a boy. "Rourke," he said. His voice was not the superintendent's voice anymore. "The center pier's going. My engineer can't hold it. I've got a freight at dawn and 1,000 head on the road and $40,000 of iron tearing my bridge apart." He stopped. The rain came down between them. "I'm asking you." Silas straightened up off the stone boat. He was near 70 years old, and he had waited 30 years to be asked, and now that it had come he did not gloat, and he did not make the man wait. He looked at Kell one long moment. Off to the side, in the lantern's edge, Vale had come up the hill behind the superintendent and stood there and said nothing at all. "Clear your men off my piers," Silas said. That was all. He turned and put his shoulder to the stone boat, and the ox leaned into the traces, and the whole load of cut apron stone began to move down the hill toward the river in the dark. What happened between that hour and the dawn, the 40 men on the bank would tell for the rest of their lives, and none of them would tell it quite right, because none of them but Tom understood what they were watching. So Tom told it. He stood at the old man's shoulder and read each move aloud to the men behind him, because somebody had to, and because he had spent 3 weeks learning to. "He's not fighting the river," Tom called out over the roar. "Watch, he's not trying to stop it." The old man went into the flood at the upstream footing where the scour was worst, roped to the pier, up to his thighs in water that would take a young man off his feet, and he began to set the apron stones. Wide and flat and keyed, one into the next, out across the scoured bed in a spreading fan. "The apron," Tom said. "He's laying it back down." The old work spread the load out flat into the riverbed, wide, so the water finds no edge to catch, no footing to dig under. Vale's iron drove all the weight down onto one point. That's the point the river ate. He's giving the load somewhere to go again. Stone by stone the fan grew, and stone by stone the current changed. Men on the bank who could not read a load table could read water, and they saw it. Where the flood had been tearing at the footing in a hard brown boil, it began to slide, to spread, to lose its grip. The apron gave it nothing to hold. The river reached for the pier and found flat keyed stone under its hand, and slid off it and went on downstream with nothing in its teeth. "It's turning," a rancher said. "God Almighty, the water's turning." Then Silas came up out of the flood and started on the arch. This was the part Tom would remember to the end of his days. The old man set voussoirs, the wedge stones, each cut to its one place in the world, into a relieving arch springing off the two sound piers on either side of the failing center one. He worked from both sides inward, the way it must be done, each wedge locking its neighbor, the whole curve holding itself up by the simple fact that every stone leaned on the next and had nowhere to fall. "The arch takes the deck," Tom said, and his voice broke on it, because he was watching 200 years of knowing done with two hands in the rain. "It carries the weight off the center pier, off the one that's failing, and spreads it into the good rock on either side. The pier doesn't have to hold anymore. The arch holds. He's taking the load off the wound. And the sag in the rails, the long, slow, deadly dip that every man had watched grow all night, stopped growing, held, and then, as the last voussoirs went in, began, so slowly you could not swear to it, to lift." Silas Rourke reached into his coat. He took out the oilcloth roll. He unwrapped it in the lantern light, with the rain running down his arms, and he lifted out the keystone, the wedge cut with the mark no man on that bank could read, the stone he'd carried under his arm the day they walked him off his own bridge. He climbed to the crown of the arch where the one gap waited, the last empty place, and he set the keystone into it, and he tapped it home with the flat of his mallet, and the arch drew tight around it and became one thing, one curve of stone that would stand as long as the valley did. The deck lifted the last quarter-inch and settled and held, and the river gave up and went on downstream, beaten, the way it had been beaten by Rourke's stone in 1849 and had forgotten it ever was. For a moment, nobody said anything. The only sound was the water and the rain. Then, Tom Ainsley bent down and picked up the oilcloth off the mud, and he looked at the mark cut into the keystone in the lantern light, and he'd seen that mark twice before, once on the oldest pier that never moved, once on a survey stone marked R and 1849 that he'd dug out of the north bank with his own hands. 3 times now. The same mark. All 3. And it came up out of him all at once, the thing he'd carried alone for 3 weeks with nobody to tell. "I knew it," Tom said, not loud. To nobody. To everybody. "I knew it was you. It was always you." Kell came forward through the crowd. He had the japanned box under his arm. He'd carried it down the hill and never let go of it, and he opened it there on the bank in the rain and took out the founding contract, soft and folded. And he read it aloud to 40 men so they'd hear it from the paper and not from him. The crossing at the Two Rivers, Kell read, let to Rourke and Son, Masons, 1849. He lowered the paper. His voice was thick. This bridge was built by his family before there was a railroad to buy it. The stone that stood tonight is Rourke's stone. The iron that failed was ours. And Josiah Kell, superintendent of the Pacific and Meridian, took off his hat in the rain in front of all his men and stood there, bareheaded before an old stonemason he had let a fool humiliate. And he did not put it back on. Vale tried once. Only once. He came out of the crowd with his tables still under his arm, wet through, his good coat hanging off him like something drowned, and he started in about the load ratings, about how the calculations were sound in principle, about factors no one could have, and he stopped. Because behind him the trestles stood, and above him the rails ran true, and up the road in the gray first light the lead steers of the cattle drive were already coming down to the crossing. The standing bridge answered him. The crossing herd answered him. 40 men who had laughed at an old man once now would not meet Vale's eyes, and that was answer enough, and he knew it. He walked off alone up the bank in the rain, and no one followed him. And the old man he'd broken did not so much as watch him go, because Silas had already turned to his crew. The men who'd stood in the flood with him, who'd handed him stone in the dark and held the ropes and never quite understood until Tom told them, he thanked them. Each one. By name. He said it plain, and he meant it, and then he knelt down in the mud and began to gather his tools, the chisel and the plumb and the straightedge, wiping each one on his sleeve and laying it in the box the way he had every night of his working life. He did not make a speech. He did not humiliate the man who had humiliated him. He picked up his tools, because the work was done, and a man gathers his tools when the work is done. At dawn the cattle crossed. 1,000 head, brown and steaming in the cold light, poured down onto the deck and over the Two-Rivers Trestle, over Rourke's stone late in the night, and the timbers took them without a shudder. The Sunday freight came in 9 days after on the same iron rails over the same old arch, and never knew how close it had come to the river. Silas Rourke stood on the north bank and watched the herd go over, and Mary came up beside him with a coat for his shoulders because he'd forgotten his own, and neither of them said much. They never had. Weeks later, the water was down, and the valley was green, and the trestle stood in the summer light as though it had never doubted itself. There was a brass plate on it now. Kell had ordered it from the foundry in the district town and set it himself on the north abutment, low, where a man crossing on foot would see it. It was small. It did not say much. It said, Two Rivers Crossing, Rourke and Son, 1849. That was all. That was everything. In the mornings, you could find the old man down at the quarry with the boy. Tom Ainsley had quit the company, or the company had quit Vale, and Tom had quit anyway, which came to the same thing, and he came up the hill now, with his sleeves rolled, to learn the one thing no load table had ever taught him. Silas showed him how to hold the chisel, how to sight a face true with nothing but the flat of his thumb, how to cut a voussoir so it knew its place before you ever set it. The boy was 22 and slow, and getting better, and the old man was patient the way he'd been patient with everything, and the stone chips gathered white around their knees in the morning light. Mary's boarding house was full all that summer. It had never been full before. Men came through on the freight and stopped a night to see the bridge the old masons saved, and Mary fed them and said little and let the valley do the talking, the way it always had. The family used to build the crossings the army couldn't. She'd said it all her life and thrown it away every time. She didn't throw it away anymore. Vale's name came off the contract. Kell saw to that himself. He wired the company one line, and the clerks who read it did not understand it, and it did not matter whether they did. The line stands, Kell wired. On stone the calculations forgot. And that was the whole of it. An old man who never learned to offer, and a company that never thought to ask, and a river that obeyed nobody's mathematics and never had. The stone was always going to hold. It was cut true by hands that learned from hands, back and back, longer than any ledger went. All it ever needed was for someone to ask. And when at last they did, the old man did not make them beg, and he did not crow, and he did not name the men who'd wronged him. He set his stone. He gathered his tools. He went home in the morning light. There is a kind of man who builds a thing so well it outlives every voice that ever doubted him, and asks for nothing while he does it, and lets the work say the only word worth saying. If you've ever been that man, if you've ever done a thing right in the silence, with nobody watching, and let it stand as your answer, then this story was for you. Comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. The brass plate went up on a Thursday, mid-July, when the valley was loud with cicadas, and the river had pulled itself back to its summer channel, low and green between the stone piers that had held. Tom Ainsley set the plate himself, with a hand drill and 2 bronze screws, because he'd asked to be the one, and Kell had said yes without hesitation. It read simply, in letters he'd cut at the blacksmith's request, for no charge, Two-Rivers Crossing, Rourke and Son, 1849. Nothing about iron. Nothing about the $9,000 contract. The stone around it was dark with old mineral, and the plate sat flush against it, and when the afternoon light came in at the right angle off the water, the letters caught, and you could read them from the near bank without squinting. Silas looked at it once. Then he went back to work. He was teaching Tom the chisel hold, not the schoolroom grip with the elbow out, but the low hold, thumb against the web of the hand, the weight of the arm doing the traveling rather than the wrist only for the final degrees of correction. Tom had good instincts and bad habits, the way young engineers always did, and Silas did not lecture. He set a block of local limestone between them and showed the angle 3 times without speaking. Then he handed over the chisel and watched the hands. Tom got the angle wrong on the first pass. Silas adjusted his elbow 1/2 inch, said nothing, and stepped back. On the second pass, the chip came off clean and true, and the stone face opened exactly the way stone was supposed to open, almost against its will, surrendering along a line it had always contained. Tom felt it. You could see it in his face, the small shock of a thing suddenly working that had not worked before, the body learning what the mind could not teach itself. "That's the way," Silas said. "That's all it is." He said it without pride, the way a man names a fact of the physical world, the way you'd say water runs downhill or that morning comes east. Tom held the chisel a moment longer before setting it down, and Silas thought he was going to ask a question, but the young man only nodded and picked up the block to examine the face he'd cut, turning it in his hands the way you'd turn a thing you meant to keep. The cattle drive had gone through clean, all 900 head, the first string crossing before the sun was full up, and the last before noon, the drovers hardly slowing. Because when a bridge is sound, a man doesn't stop to be grateful. He just crosses and goes on, and that was the best possible thing. The ordinary continuation of work. The herd sold in a week. The freight note cleared. Kell had not mentioned Vale's name to anyone since the morning he walked off, and nobody filled the silence with it. Mary put an extra table in the boarding house dining room when the men came through that summer. She bought new chairs for it. Plain oak. 4 of them, from a man in the next town who'd made them himself, and she set a canning jar of sunflowers on the table because sunflowers asked for nothing and gave anyway, and she had always thought that was the correct disposition for a table. She didn't explain any of this to anyone. She didn't need to. In the mornings, before the heat came, Silas was at the quarry or at the piers, and sometimes Tom was with him, and sometimes he went alone. The sun came up over the eastern ridge and threw long shadows across the river, and the pier stones caught the low light and held it briefly, the way old stone holds everything briefly and lets it go, and Silas's hands moved over the face of the next course, feeling for the true, and found it, and set the stone down on its bed with the small clean sound of one right thing following another.